If you joined us for our first meeting, this is going to be a repeat of our first meeting, which was about 2 weeks ago on October the 1st. And if you're okay, I'm going to share my screen here. And I think everyone can probably see my screen. So this is the third of three scheduled community informational meetings, where the goal of the city is to provide information on Measure R. These meetings, again, are for informational purposes only. The goal is to either persuade or dissuade people in terms of how they vote. The city is not advocating either for or against Measure R, but rather our goal is to provide information so when voters go to the polls, they feel fully informed and they have a good understanding of what they're voting either for or against. But again, the goal here is not to encourage or discourage anything. It's simply to provide facts and information. So this evening is David McPherson with HDL. HDL is a consulting firm that specializes in sales tax information, and then they also have a branch that specializes in cannabis. There are roughly 126 cities and counties in the state of California that have some kind of ordinance when it comes to cannabis regulations, and David has been involved with about 77 of those, if memory serves me. So a brief overview about the city of Madera. Historically, the city of Madera has prohibited cannabis uses in terms of retail, manufacturing, production, or cultivation of cannabis. However, the sale and use of cannabis is actually permitted in the state of California, subject to a local government such as the city or county allowing it. The city of Madera currently does not allow for it. And I apologize for that. So a couple of months ago, we had a conversation with the city council. It was in public session where the city council suggested that the city retain HDL as a subject matter expert to consider different options for cannabis. There are many different paths to permitting cannabis or to not permit cannabis. And what the path that the city elected to explore was to place a sales tax measure on the ballot in November. It's the general ballot as Measure R. And then eventually that would also be coupled with a regulatory ordinance that would outline the how, the what, and the where. So the ballot measure is, should the city tax cannabis? And if the voters vote yes, and it does have to pass by majority vote, so it's 50% plus one, at that point the city council could come back and say, this is the type of cannabis, these are the types of cannabis businesses we want to allow or not allow. This is the areas where we want to permit them or not permit them. And we do have it looks like someone raised their hand. And for some reason, I'm not seeing. I believe, I'm not just sure if these two have your hand, but there was a hand raised that I saw very briefly and then it went back off. I should preface it by saying that on the bottom of your screen, we have a Q&A. And if you'd like, for the attendees, you can ask your questions there. We will read them out loud. We are not going to state your name. And at that point, we will try to respond as best as we can. And then also what we'll do is we are trying to keep our website up to date with any information that we get. So with that, I'm going to continue with the presentation, if that's okay. Now I'm going to reshare my screen one more time. So the ordinance that was submitted to the voters for consideration in the general election, the maximum number of words that may be on the ballot is 75. And the ordinance itself includes the maximum amounts that could be charged should cannabis be permitted. The city council at any time can go beneath the thresholds that are adopted by the voters, but the council cannot exceed the thresholds established by the voters. The ordinance itself, it's a relatively lengthy ordinance that has a lot of the legal terminology and the language, and that ordinance is found on our website. So again, the ballot measure is 75 words, but the ordinance itself is quite lengthy, and that is available on our website if you would like additional details on that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David, but prior to me doing so, again, this is the third of the 3 workshops that we've scheduled. However, if anyone in the community would like to meet or talk about it, either in a small group setting via Zoom or with a much larger one, city staff is available. We are keeping our website active, so it's madera.gov/measure-r. We have an email address, measure-r@madera.gov, and then we also have our telephone number that you can always reach out to us, and we'd be more than happy to discuss it. That number's on your screen. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn it over to David, if that's okay. David, would you like to take over from here?
Okay, let's see if I can grab my files on here. Is it sharing yet?
Not yet, David.
Okay, here, let's see if I can share there. Now, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll just make it from the beginning and see from beginning. There we go. See it now? Okay. Okay, so we will get going. Everyone can see it now. Thank you for your opportunity to be here. Those that are joining us to hear us, as City Manager indicated, this is our third. The last one was done in Spanish as well. So if they happen to know anyone that might be interested in listening to it, a presentation in Spanish, it's on the website as well. This is kind of just the outline of things that we're going to cover to kind of just have an understanding of how and why tax measures are looked at, but also then strategically on a few of the things related to it. So the first thing we're going to look at is the different components of the cannabis and variations of things that can be taxed and where people do actually have different types of activities or licenses associated with this. So the tax is a general tax, as we'll go into more detail on that, but it's solely for government purposes. It is not a specific tax. Again, we will go into details of that. Proactively, just looking at it, we're going to tax the adult use side of it. We're going to tax the medicinal side of it. We talk about if the city doesn't permit any type of business in town, at a minimum, you're going to be able to tax the illegal activity. And we're going to talk about what you can impose a tax for businesses that come from out of town. So 2 things that it can do even if the city chooses not to permit anything in town. And then legislation is always changing on us on things that are thrown at us. So if there's something there that becomes of a concern or a commodity that's there. We've seen a lot of things happening with vaping laws. I would point this here legislatively, and then regulatory changes where the city at one time could ban deliveries. Now the state has made it that they're under current situation that you can't ban deliveries, and therefore this ordinance would allow the activity to be taxed, even though they're not physically in the city. We're also trying to examine some of the future trends of this and hemp regulation. I'll go a little more detail on that when the time comes. But ultimately, the goal is that should the city desire to have an industry or work with out-of-town industry, is really a collaboration looking at an equitable solution to that through how you actually tax them, the business operators, so that they can be sustainable. And we'll go into more detail on that as well. So the first thing I'm going to talk about, to just kind of give a general broad view of things is understanding the license types that are out there, so you know when we're talking about activities what we're talking about. So this chart really is going to conveys two things. One, it's the flow of the product that can occur and the different types of licenses from the commodity standpoint that could be taxed. So you can see the cultivation is the growing, processing, curing, drying of it. Could be done indoors, could be outdoors. Again, at this point, the city has not determined anything going to be done, but just the type of ways it can be taxed. And they're at different rates for different types of activities because they have a different value based on that. Then the manufacturing, there's two different types of manufacturing that occurs. Some make oils, some just do production or packaging. Some actually make different products and then package them and ship them out. And then you have the distribution. That is where the product is just moved from one business to another business. The goal of that is that the business would not be moving their own products. It would be done by a distributor that has no relationship to the license itself, unless the businesses, some businesses can get a separate distribution license. And then through the distribution, there's the testing component of that, which is another activity of quality insurance. And then the only person that sells it to the end user or the consumer would be a retailer. That could be both a storefront, as you typically have retail, or what we call a non-storefront retailer, which is someone that another term would be as a delivery service that they would do. So these are the different varieties of things that in the tax ordinance that is included in it. So a question always comes up regarding, well, if we have a tax measure and we generate revenue, is it just going to be used to regulate the industry? And I want to emphasize that there are two different ways to generate revenues. There's the regulatory fees, just like you have for if you want to go use a swimming pool the city has, or you want to do in a softball league that the city has, or any activities. There's usually a fee associated with that to run that program. It would be the same case here for the cannabis. If the city chooses to have cannabis business in town, then they would set up fees for not only to bring them into town, just like you would for a building and planning department for any type of business. You would also set up fees to have oversight of this. So it wouldn't come out of the general fund, or that you would be augmenting or taking general fund money out of it to allow them to be here. On the other side, then you have the ballot measure, that the ballot measure that's going to be presented to you is a general tax, requires a 50% plus one to pass. And if it is, it's a general fund tax. And that can be used for multiple services. It could be for repairing streets. It could be for improving your parks. It could be for housing any type of special programs that you have, dealing with the homeless situation, public safety. It's just a matter of what your policymakers want to use it for as a priority. So future trends, how does that affect that? We want to be mindful as how you word the ordinance and how it's worded is to address these things. Technology changes. A lot of us experience, brick and mortars, but all of a sudden you have the Amazons of the world or other .com businesses that change how taxation is done, or what can and cannot be taxed. So this addresses technology and how that's done. We mentioned about the evolving of the hemp regulations, which we'll talk again in more detail, and also with the restrictions of vaping. We also mentioned about different products in there. So just how things are shifting and evolving as this becomes more of a normalization of understanding it. And I think the one that why we're having this virtual meeting is what COVID has done to us, how that's changed behavior of people on purchasing and illnesses and medical conditions in which they are using these products. So as I said, we were going to extend a little more on the hemp. Right now, hemp is not legal in California, as it is from use of the plant. You will see products in your Costco, you will see them in GNC stores, you'll see stuff that's made out of hemp products. They'll say it's CBD, and it's really a percentage of what is a THC content in there. But right now in California, the only thing that can be made legally in California is hemp that is 0.03%. So that's like 1/3 of 1%. And it must be made from seeds of hemp plants. That will change. And as that changes and has a little more, then that will be a commodity that not only has a value added for a medical use, but also for a consumer use. And therefore, if the city looks mindfully down the road or has to address hemp stores or business operating in, then it's being in a position to tax that under this process. And so, as I indicated to you, in California, it's not legally, but there are bills that are advancing beyond the AB 228 bill that was in 2020. The COVID's kind of put a delay to that at this time. And as Arnaldo mentioned, tax ordinances, business tax, any kind of tax ordinance, you have structure of just some basic things that are in there. The core things has the purpose and intent, definitions of everything that can be taxed, what the imposition of the tax rates are, which we'll go into more detail, and just procedural things of how to approach it, but also the ability to audit and examine it. If you're concerned about businesses, trying to be shaky, then you have this oversight to them. At the same time, as we mentioned about the COVID situation, this ordinance is designed to have some tax disaster relief so they wouldn't have to pay. And the reason we say that is some businesses are based on square footage. So if they have no product that they can sell, then they shouldn't be subject to a tax for something that they're not being able to do just because they own a building. And then the key to this as well, as Arnaldo mentioned, the amendment or modification. The council has the authority to adjust rates up and down, make some changes, everything within the authority of them, as long as they don't increase the tax rate that you as a voter made a decision to approve. So the importance of the rates and why you make decisions of what we've created on these rates. There's a lot of change in time is why these rates are created. The important part of it is you want the tax to be high enough to generate proceeds to offset costs so that you have something to have value added to your community of a revenue, but low enough that you're not creating such a burden on the businesses so that they can stay in business, be competitive, create jobs, and be here should that be the decision down the road. You want to look at what your neighbors are doing, and so this will be competitive to your neighbors, or if your neighbors change a little bit, you can adjust your rates to be competitive with you like you do for TOT and you do for other types of fees or taxes associated with that. And then because it's the industry is still evolving, trying to get some rate to let them stabilize, let the industry normalize in your community or in the region, and then kind of reevaluate of what that means of increasing or decreasing rates. And as I mentioned, creating flexibility so the city council can increase or decrease the rates. As we all have to do with inflation of things, we create indexes for inflation for those rates that are flat rate, not based on gross receipts. And it will tax all the categories. And as I mentioned to you, even the delivery services and the hemp activities, should they occur. So as I mentioned to you, let's assume that the city council doesn't do anything. They choose not to allow any cannabis businesses in town. You're still subject to state law that you cannot stop out-of-town deliveries. And so part of the goal of this tax measure is that if out-of-town deliveries come into town, you can impose a tax on them because they are coming in your community. So you derive some benefit from that. The other part, as I mentioned, that if you have any illegal activity, sometimes it takes a lot of work and resources to try to shut them down. And some of the best ways to do that is doing a tax assessment on them, even though it's not lawful. You can still tax them so that you can put some pressure on them to shut down if they're unlawful businesses in town. So two value-added things, regardless if you have businesses in town. So these are the rates that we shared with you. There is a maximum rate that we wanted to have, and that's important that you have a cap because the businesses want to look at what's their worst scenario not their best scenario. Should councils change or situations change, they want to make sure that then they're investing in your community, that they also know what the risk factors are if there were scenario. So these are prevailing rates. If you look at the 124 tax measures and what averages are, these are in the rates that are the new norm for today's environment. As we mentioned, the council has the ability to reduce these rates to a certain degree and then bring them back up to these rates. You will also see that these rates have different categories of fees. The reason why is there's a different valuation of benefit to these businesses of what they do and their profit margins for each category. And therefore these rates reflect that on these tax rates. So we have two things why it's important of what these tax rates are. We call it the cumulative tax rates. So you will see by this chart, we have the recommended rates, and you will, as you note in the highlighted yellow areas, that the rates are of a different rates for each of the categories. And at the same time, the goal is that we want to keep the total cumulative rate under 30%. That is a model used for tobacco, of where people just go to the illicit market or won't buy the product in your community if the rates are too high, and the businesses won't be sustainable, as we mentioned to you. So you can see here where we're at the very bottom, where the 29.49, it stays under that rate. And because of the impact of the state, you will see the state excise tax and other taxes at the state level are 25%. So for each business, you're really needing to keep it down under that 5 to 6%, but more than in primary for retail has a higher rate, but the other ones that have to compete with other businesses in other communities, you want to make sure that they can be competitive with the rates that you're providing them in order to move their products. So if you looked at on this slide, if you looked at the maximum rates that we recommended to you, you will see that if the council actually stayed at the high rates for each one of the categories, that we go beyond that 30%. Now we're kind of on that tipping edge of where it starts putting a little stress on the businesses if they're having to compete with other competitors that are in cities or counties that have a better competitive tax rate for them, and therefore finding that balance for them to continue being sustainable. So in the tax measure, we've, as the city manager indicated, is that there's 75 words. In that 75 words, we've also included the potential revenues required by the election code of what the price range is. So we provided you some scenarios. Those scenarios are based on assumption of $18 million. If you had 6 businesses, which is still a minimum amount of business, not an overwhelming a lot, but you can see we're very conservative of what the rates would be at different levels. And as you move up to the moderate of having 5 businesses, but doing a little bit better per business. And then if you had only 3 businesses, then doing very, very well because there's less competition and potentially that they're more successful at it. With that, you can see the ranges goes from 4% at $720,000 to as aggressive as over $1 million at a 6% rate. Of course, that's the flat rate scenario for this, not the breakdown that we shared with you in the previous slide. So the next steps, we've already done yesterday, conducted the Measure Our Outreach in Spanish, and previous to that, we had one 2 weeks ago. And then today's the final Measure Our Outreach meeting for the workshops. And then the next steps after that would be the tax measure would be on the November 3rd ballot for you to vote on. And then should the ordinance pass, it would be ineffective if approved by the voters come January 1st of 2021. And so with that, if we have any questions, I will turn this back over to Arnoldo.
Thank you, David. So we have received one question from the attendees, and if it's okay, I'm going to read it, and then both David and I will attempt to answer it the best we can. And the question is, I use Merced dispensaries. Why not follow their lead? Question. Madera is already so far behind the curve. High-speed rail will be completed before the Madera Good Old Boys Club moves on opening sales here. So to answer that question, is there are about 126 communities in the state of California that currently allow some form of cannabis. On the November ballot, so there are 26 cities or counties that have placed a similar ballot measure similar to the city of Madera's. They're not identical, but they pertain to cannabis specifically. So again, we are one of 26 communities that have placed a ballot measure for cannabis. My understanding, I think that Merced also placed theirs on the ballot. And I'm going to look towards David a number of years ago because I do not know the year that Merced placed it on the ballot. And I'm not just sure if you happen to know the date on that, David. I don't believe you were the consultant for the city of Merced.
That's correct. Again, I think one of the things to be mindful, this is a community decision. We appreciate your input on this. This is a community decision where they're doing a thoughtful process. Madera in 2016, as a community, did not have a 50+ support for Prop 64. I think the fact that we are now having a little more education in the community, having a better understanding it, and other cities around them are moving and doing something, they're at least more open to do an outreach and have this discussion that the council has done a good job of thoughtfully doing in this approach. But it's a policy decision to bring it to the voters first to approve the tax. And if and only that occurs, that at this point, that is their decision and that is a policy in process.
Yeah, thank you. So again, I'm not, I can't speak to why it was not on the ballot prior to now. I arrived at the city December of 2018 after the last election. And I was not with the city organization to find out what the dynamics were. But with this upcoming election, the council felt that it would be appropriate to place it on the ballot. And that's where it's at now. And then the second part is that we've also, if the voters approve the measure, if they vote in favor of the measure, we've also retained David and his team to assist the city prepare land use regulations specific for cannabis. And at that point, the city council will discuss publicly the types of businesses, if there's a number that should be permitted, are there distance requirements or proximate to sensitive land uses, and those types of items. So David is under contract as a subject matter expert to assist the city navigate that. But again, it's going to be predicated on what the voters do. We felt that it was appropriate to take it to the voters. Not all cities take it to the voters. There are a couple of cities that take a different approach, and there's nothing wrong with that approach. But in Madera, the council felt that the appropriate thing to do would be to take it to the voters. So hopefully that responds to your question. However, if it does not, always feel free to reach out, and I'd be more than happy to continue the conversation. I'm not sure if any of the attendees have any additional questions, but we can give it a couple of minutes.
And as a reminder, Arnaldo did indicate that the website in the email and the contact information should you have additional questions afterwards, then you can direct them to there as well.
So I'm not seeing any additional questions. So while attendees contemplate questions, the only other thing that I'll add that I know came up before is why is the city not promoting or advertising Measure R? And again, it's the city legally cannot promote as an organization, either promote to either persuade or dissuade for or against a measure. Private individuals can, or private companies can, but the city is not going to spend any taxpayer dollars on either on either supporting either pro or against any tax measure. So just in case, because that's a question that I received recently from a few different people. I'm not seeing any additional questions from the attendees. So with that, I think that concludes our presentation this evening. If you do have any questions from any of the attendees moving forward, again, feel free to reach out to the city. We would be more than happy to sit down and talk this through with folks. At the end of the day, we feel that the more informed the community is, the better we are. And thank you very much for taking the time this evening, for joining us. We appreciate it. And with that, it looks like we do have, okay, can we please provide the website before we close? Absolutely. I'm gonna share my screen one more time that has the, that has all of our contact information. If you can just bear with me for a few seconds here. Okay, it looks like Joseph is going to be answering the question.
No, I'm just marking that the question's in the process of being answered at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. So on your screen, you will see the website, madera.gov/measure-r, our email, measure.r@madera.gov, and there's a telephone number right there as well. So if anything comes up between now and